All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Patrick Murphy. I'm a senior fellow at the Association for the United States Army and the former Undersecretary of the Army. It is great to be back here at AUSA. We have an incredible panel today, but just want to say, for those who just left the congressional breakfast, what a great speech by both General Milley, our Chief of Staff, and Secretary Brian McCarthy, our Acting Secretary of the Army. What a great leadership team and how blessed we are as a nation. Thank you for joining us at this contemporary military forum titled Army Material Readiness for the Future Force. As your professional association, the Association of the United States Army and the Institute of Land Warfare are proud to provide forums like this one throughout the year to broaden the knowledge base of Army professionals and those who support our Army. These professional development seminars are AUSA's way of amplifying the U.S. Army's narrative to audiences inside the Army and help to further the association's mission to be the voice for the Army and support the soldier. Of course, we could not do this alone. AUSA relies on its members to help tell the Army story and to support our soldiers and their families. A strong membership base is vitally important for our advocacy efforts in Congress, the Pentagon, and the defense of the industrial base, and to the public and communities across the country through AUSA's 121 local chapters. For those of you, Army professionals, who are not yet members of your professional organization, we encourage you to join with a special introductory offer. You will find the invitation on your chair. It should be right here, it looks like this. Just bring it to the AUSA membership booth, booth 307 in Exhibit Hall A, or online at ausa.org/membership. If you're already a member of AUSA, thank you for staying with us, and please give your invitation to your fellow professional. You'll be doing a service to the association and to the United States Army. And now I'd like to turn this over to my friend and former colleague, Lisha Adams at the U.S. Army Materiel Command. She is a great American and a great professional. It's my honor to introduce. Please give it up for Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Honorable Murphy. Well, as Eleanor Roosevelt said, great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people. So I'm glad to be among great minds this morning. Thank you all for joining us. Today you will hear from the panelists their perspective on the Army's investment strategy to enable decisive overmatch for the future force, how we use that strategy in connection with battle concepts to create multiple dilemmas for our adversaries, and how it takes on the character of conflict when applied to a specific AOR. It is truly my pleasure to introduce our august panel members. Major General Cedric Wins, Commander, Research, Development, and Engineering Command, Army Materiel Command. Major General Bo Dyess, Acting Director, U.S. Army Capabilities Integration Center, Training and Doctrine Command. Major General John George, Force Development, U.S. Army G8. Mr. Scott Davis, Program Executive Officer, Combat Support, Combat Service Support, Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. Major General Susan Davidson, Commander, 8th Theater Sustainment Command, U.S. Army Pacific. And Dr. Lauren Thompson, Chief Operating Officer, Lexington Institute. Please join me in a round of applause. You know, oftentimes when we hear material readiness, we think of current readiness, the availability of materiel required by a military organization to support its wartime activities or contingencies. For the last 16 years, we've had to focus on current readiness, and General Milley's #1 priority is readiness, and there is no other #1. But close behind readiness is the future force and future readiness. President Kennedy said, "Those who look only to the past or present are certain to miss the future." So as you heard this week, the Army is pivoting its strategic focus onto modernization. It is very important that we produce readiness today and tomorrow. This panel will address what we need to invest in today to ensure future force readiness tomorrow. The modernization investment strategy has not changed over the years. It has consisted of leveraging U.S. technological advantage, both commercial and organic, to address our vulnerabilities. It has been based upon the National Defense Strategy and available resources. Modernization is composed of S&T, new development, modification, and recapitalization. S&T funding has been focused on next-gen technology. New development has been focused on improved mobility, survivability, and lethality. Modification to existing systems focused on buying back weight, space, and power. And recapitalization focused on removing obsolescence and ensuring sustainable readiness. Over time, though, the non-discretionary spending has decreased and more funding is required for new requirements like cybersecurity, automation, and the rising cost of sustainment. In fact, O&S costs are rising and outpacing the rate of inflation. The rising cost, coupled with budget cuts, are generating a growing concern for future readiness. It is more than just prioritizing how we spend our money, because when our means no longer support our ends, we must change our ways. So it is imperative to reduce the cost of doing business in order to ensure sufficient funding for modernization, and we must change our thinking about modernization. Albert Einstein said, "The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking." A way to change our thinking is through collaboration. Collaboration across technology, acquisition, and sustainment, as well as collaboration across the Department of Defense, industry, international, and academic communities. I encourage you to listen to the panelists as a way to challenge your thinking. Is your thinking impeding collaboration or innovation? If so, change your thinking. It's very important that we produce readiness today and tomorrow. So I will be followed by Major General Bo Dyess. He will describe the character of conflict, of how that character of conflict influences requirements from a multi-domain battle and Army material readiness perspective. Bo?
Relate to multi-domain battle and Army materiel readiness. And quite frankly, I've done many panels before and many discussions. I've had news interviews yesterday and Innovators Corner, but I'm particularly nervous this morning because I'm being evaluated in this panel by my wife, Sharon, and more importantly, my 25-year-old daughter, Marilyn, who are here with us today. But I'm very pleased to be here. I'd like to thank Alicia Adams, AMC, and Cedric Wins from RD Ecom. Usually I see them on the other side of the VTC, so it's always a pleasure to work with them in person and provide some comments for today. You know, at the Army Capabilities Integration Center, ARCIC, where my boss received a broadening and developmental assignment about on the 20th of February, we think clearly about the future of armed conflict, because that requires consideration of war's enduring nature and how the character of conflict is changing. The nature of war is pretty much unchanged. It is wasteful, it is bloody, people will be killed. It is a terrible thing. But the only thing worse than warfare is not being prepared for war or losing one. And really, our job inside of the Army is to be prepared every day when we go to work. And I talk with this to the guys down at, and gals at ARCIC all the time. I truly believe that they get up, look in the mirror, and say, what am I going to do today to help prepare the Army so that we can be ready for warfare? To meet the nation's needs as required. Nations that don't truly study the character of war and how it affects them in the future will do so at their peril, and that's not from me, that's from Clausewitz. The character of war tends to define how we prepare for conflict, which are influenced by such things as a change in technological change, changes in the composition of the international system and a state's ability to govern. In Arctic, we think about the future using threats, enemies, and adversaries, our mission statements, changes in technology, but we also consider history and lessons learned. One of the things that we do a lot in working in concepts, campaign of learning and capabilities, is how do the analysts take those observations and lessons learned and turn them into an analytical underpinning in which we'll make recommendations on what the future of the Army is. So we look at various factors that influence change, technology implementation, professional military education by states, industrial mights, innovation, et cetera, that led to different characters of warfare in ours and others' histories. And we can develop a grounded projection of the future. And I'm an evolutionary guy as opposed to a revolutionary guy. Sometimes I think we overreach when we are thinking in revolutionary terms. Evolutionary is the way I think that you don't miss your marks when you're aiming at the future. But based on our current and projected trends of the operational environment and how we project the character of war in the future, we can make 4 overarching assumptions that become major implications for driving change. Another thing I truly believe that all professional organizations should do is question your own assumptions from time to time, because we all use assumptions to substitute as facts in planning. And when things that underpin those assumptions change, you've got to be in an organization that's flexible enough to go back and question your own assumptions, because if you miss the mark, that means soldiers will be killed in the future for the Army. Adversaries will challenge U.S. forces in all domains: the land, the air, the sea, the space, and cyberspace. Peer adversaries have capabilities to contest U.S. forces in all domains with increasing effectiveness. The battlefield is becoming more lethal. The capability and capacity of adversaries to bring lethal effect to bear alters our strategic and operational calculus in new and different ways. Operational complexity is increasingly global. Despite this complexity, adversaries have demonstrated abilities to operate in these environments, especially in the regions surrounding their homelands or their near abroad. And deterring aggression is more challenging. Adversaries present 2 challenges to deterrence. Adversaries can and will operate with and through surrogates below the threshold of armed conflict, and adversaries will change U.S. cost-benefit relationship with sophisticated all-domain anti-access and area denial capabilities. These implications are the force driving our need for a new operational concept, a multi-domain battle concept. And they will affect how we fight, because the battlefield is expanding, compressing, and converging simultaneously. It's expanded, if no other way, by geography, but also the line between armed conflict and threshold between armed conflict is blurred. It's compressed because cyber capabilities decrease our decision cycles, and there's so much information out there that could become knowledge or could become understanding. And it's converged because all the facets of state power are in play: little green men, government agencies, militaries, proxies, social medias, etc. Concepts such as multi-domain battle drive change in the Army because they provide us an aim point to the future. Because the Army right now can't do what our multi-domain battle concept says. If we could do the things that the concept says, we'd move it over to doctrine. Doctrine is the things that we can do. Concepts provide the aim point in which we progress to. To change also requires us to consider how we develop these capabilities. There's no doubt about it, we've got to consider the technological rate of change as it affects the requirements development. In some cases, requirements could be obsolete before a requirements document is even developed or finished. Cyber and electromagnetic spectrum capabilities are an example. In other cases, the lifespan of a capability might be much shorter. Other examples include capability development and acquisition timelines, which need to be faster. Industry is able to develop some capabilities quicker than the military, but we can't leverage industry as much as we should. And to ensure that we're able to execute that warfare in the future, we need to closely link the science and technology efforts with the capability developers to know what technology is mature and which ones aren't. Working with industry, we need to overcome our risk-averse culture that prevents us from speaking with industry, and we need to know what industry is working on, and it's hard to work and develop the concept without knowing what's in the realm of the possible. Otherwise, you're in the revolutionary area. We need to develop requirements faster and get them approved faster, and the Chief of Staff of the Army's initiatives and the Secretary of the Army's initiatives are going to help to do that. And we need to test and experiment to know how well something will work in the real world. Army Test and Evaluation Command and Joint Modernization Command at Fort Bliss, through their network integration evaluation and their joint warfighting assessment, have a huge role to play in that. And innovative ways to explore prototyping, such as early synthetic prototyping that I discussed yesterday at the Innovators Corner, and Operation Overmatch, which we opened to beta testing last night, are ways that could provide insights on prototyping and to shorten the developmental process. And we must have clearly defined priorities, in which the Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army have just published their 6 priorities for modernization. If we're unable to develop the right capabilities because we didn't know something existed, or they take forever to be developed and delivered to soldiers, then we won't be able to fight in all domains. We won't improve our lethality. We won't possess capabilities for a complex environment, and we certainly won't be able to prevent conflict by deterring would-be aggressors. And believe me, the people who want to deter a fight are wearing uniforms in this room, both in the United States Army, our joint partners, and our coalition allies. Paraphrasing, as the SecDef once said, everything can be clearly linked to readiness, not just readiness for today, but readiness for tomorrow also. And we have to improve our readiness with increased lethality, not only material solutions, but across doctrine and organization and training and material and leadership and education and personnel and facilities. And Army modernization is a driving force for all of that. I'd like to thank you for providing an opportunity for me to give some opening comments, and stand ready for your questions after the other panel members. Thanks.
Thank you, Bo. With that, General Wins.
Okay. Thanks, Ms. Adams, and thank you, AUSA, for hosting this event. I'm particularly happy to be on a panel with 7 members of folks that I've been a part of working with over the years. But I'm very, very happy to be on a panel with Bo Dyess and John George, for the simple fact that we have, each of us have covered similar positions and similar jobs over the last few years. Bo's been the capability director, I've been the capability director. John George has been the capability director, Bo's been the FD, I've been the FD. John George has been the FD, or is the FD. And so I guess we think alike, we do things in quite a similar fashion. And so each one of us, I think we have our wives here. I probably would say that my spouse has already taken notes to critique me after this. She's already written something about my posture, I'm sure. But it's good to be here. One thing that I would say that I think each of us in our various different jobs have advocated for a long time, which is very refreshing coming out of the breakfast this morning to hear, is the need for the Army to reestablish a clear set of priorities for modernization and to provide direction and focus to the department on where we need to go to look at how you build capability for the future force. And so in each of our jobs, we have a part of that responsibility. As it exists right now, my job is as the Commanding General for Research, Development, and Engineering Command, is to be a part of a very, very diverse and technically astute team of engineers and scientists who provide capability to the Army in a number of different ways. And oftentimes, the different ways in which the scientists and engineers that are a part of RDECOM provide technological capability is not fully understood. And so I wanted to just kind of pick up on one of the themes and one of the comments coming from Ms. Adams about collaboration and start there because of the fact that a lot of times what we are trying to do to build the capability that Bo Dyess talked about, it occurs through very, very complex undertakings. And a lot of times that's lost, and it's all often occurs in environments where we are resource constrained, where we have some very, very ambitious ideas about how technology can enable the warfighter. And so RDECOM, we like to say, when folks ask us, we like to say, what is our primary mission? What are we here for? What do we do for the warfighter? And I simply put it as we are here to provide the technology that leads to the capability that empowers, unburdens, and protects the warfighter. And that's important because most of the technology, no matter what it is, it's an enabling technology. We want soldiers to be more lethal, then we have to give them various different capabilities in our air platforms, in our ground combat vehicles, in our soldier lethality by way of munitions, by way of guns, by way of all kinds of different technical capability to enable the soldiers to go out and do what they do, particularly in close combat. And so that's very important. But the complexity of how we do this, which drives the need for collaboration, is set in the fact that oftentimes the technology that's being developed for the Army is done in a combination of ways. And so within RDECOM, the expertise, the engineering expertise and the scientific expertise that we have certainly allows us to do research and discovery in various different efforts that might lead to various different types of technology. But it also allows us to collaborate with academia and to fund research efforts that academic institutions are doing to look in different areas that would potentially provide capability for the Army. We also work to collaborate with industry. And so many of the deliveries of capability that we've provided to the Army, the S&T enterprise, not just RDECOM, have provided to the Army, has come about through collaboration with industry, both in providing technology to them that they can incorporate into the various different platforms and systems that meet the requirements, and also taking on various different immature technology that perhaps industry has discovered that might not be necessarily advanced enough for an engineering effort, and they may toss it over the transom to the engineers and scientists that are part of RDECOM. And then we have to collaborate among ourselves. The efforts that take place within RDECOM, I've got 6 research development and engineering centers and 1 lab, principally an Army research lab. And we have to collaborate because the platform that you see in the form of the next generation combat vehicle, it will have a lot of the technological capability that comes from the work that is done by our tank and automotive folks with collaboration with the industry partners. But it also have sensors that come from our communications and electronics and research and development arm. It'll come from our missile and armaments folks as well. So collaboration is a huge part of what we have to do to make sure that the technology advancements that the Army wants us to achieve can be accomplished working in and around the S&T community, in and around working with industry. The other part about the work that our engineers and scientists are able to do is to have the ability through our research efforts to transfer knowledge. And so oftentimes when people are looking for a hard deliverable, sometimes that deliverable is in the form of knowledge. And that knowledge oftentimes, when we're talking about a program that is in advance or prior to a milestone, an acquisition strategy, it's to help inform those requirements. So when Bo Dyess talks about the character of war, we are keenly interested in that from the standpoint of trying to inform how technology might enable the warfighter to be able to succeed in those different characters of war, those different types of conflicts that are likely to exist in the next war or the next fight after that. So those things are extremely important to us. Just to talk a little bit about the resources, the Army has been saw fit to ensure that the resources that are devoted to S&T have remained stable over the years, even over the 15 years of conflict. They have not done anything detrimental to what I refer to as the seed corn for the different ideas and the technology that goes on. And so we've been relatively stable. Now what that means is it allows us to not only get after the things that are necessary for near-term readiness, which are oftentimes those engineering efforts for life cycle sustainment, and also those engineering efforts where we are partnered with the program executive officers and the PMs and the product managers who are bringing on capability for the force. But it also ensures that we can do those S&T efforts, those long-term S&T efforts. I just want to give you an idea of kind of some of the numbers of the roughly about $6 billion that comes to the S&T enterprise. About half of that is in the form of the appropriations that we get, and the other half comes through reimbursable efforts, reimbursable dollars. Of that amount, about 64%, what we characterize as budget activity 6.1, which is basic research. It's a split, about 64% though goes to universities and industry. Within the 6.2, which is applied research, about 33% goes to industry. And within the 6.3, which is more the advanced application as we proceed to getting the advanced technical readiness levels, that also goes to industry. The one area that I think we're challenged the most in, and that's why we talk a lot about prototyping, and when I say prototyping, I want to make sure people understand, we're talking about experimental prototyping. We're talking about shaping the understanding of requirements in the art of the possible. Well, as it stands right now, the $64, about 90% goes to industry and about 10% stays within the Army to look at those different types of experimental efforts. So I think that there needs to be some thinking about the rebalancing of how those $64 are applied. If we're going to get after some of the things that the Chief and the Secretary mentioned as the priorities for the Army, and we're going to have to be very, very judicious about those efforts and what we think those payoffs will be for those efforts that we undertake in experimental prototyping and experimental design. There's a number of different things that we have been able to transition, and transition still remains a challenge for us because in order to transition, you have to get folks to underwrite risk. You have to get folks to understand that a piece of technology that is coming in is either going to be a game changer or it's going to give the Army some advanced capability that would enable the warfighter to do something better. But oftentimes it is focused on this linear process that we're talking about. And so to make those transitions are key. And so we've been working in partnership with the resourcing community, in partnership with the requirements community, to ensure that we have the types of conversations that set the stage for the agreement between the technology transitioning into programs of record that either already exist or are soon to be established. And that's going to be key because if we can get our hands around the importance of those transitions and what added capability it provides to the warfighter, then we should be able to go to the leadership of the Army and present it to them and explain to them the value that it brings the warfighter to get them. It will require Army leadership to underwrite the insertion of technologies that are possibly disruptive to cost, schedule, and performance of a program. So I'll stop there. I just wanted to give you all a little bit something to think about, and I'll turn it over to John George.
Well, thanks. Good morning, everybody. Great to see you. I see some faces out there. We do have the spotlights in our eyes a bit. So it's sort of intermission time. I'm the guy in the middle. And moving towards the small-minded end of the table here, no, in the middle of the table. I'm not going to talk about people, but I'm going to start with a little bit of this day in history, just to give us a little break here. And so I'm going to start with the closest in time, and I'm going to go back in time. So in 1985, the Kilo Laro hijacking ends. Might bring back some memories for some folks. In 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigns, replaced 2 months later by Gerald Ford. In 1965, the 1st Cav Division begins operations in Vietnam. 1953, a mutual defense treaty between the United States and the Republic of Korea is concluded in Washington, D.C. 1924, the Washington Senators win their only World Series, defeating the heavily favored New York Giants 4-3. In 1913, construction ended on the Panama Canal. And in 1877, George Custer's funeral was held at West Point. And then the last, and the furthest back in history, was in 1845, the Naval School, later renamed the United States Naval Academy, opens with 50 midshipmen students and 7 professors in Annapolis, Maryland. And so I asked my friend on the Joint Staff, one of my Navy buddies, I said, well, can you help me understand then, why doesn't the Navy have any ice on the sidelines during the football games? And they said, well, the guy with the recipe graduated last year. So, I further asked, I said, well, how many midshipmen plebes does it really take to change a light bulb? And he says, none, it's a second-year course. So, intermission, small-mindedness. So how does any of that have anything to do, the history with where we are today? I would say it doesn't really relate a whole lot, except there were a lot of changes, frequent stops and starts of things. And I think that's an important idea as we work through modernization and developing a resource strategy that will take us into the future. And one of the things that I have learned over time is continuity and consistency of priorities over time is very important for our institution. And so getting started with 6 priorities is very important. But in the institutional processes, the realignment of our staffs to get after a new way of doing business is going to be important over time to keep senior leaders clearly focused, and the communities that work to build capabilities clearly focused over an extended period of time to see the outcomes that we desire. And so we all know the world's changed. We talked about that. Bo Dyess set the for what when we think about if we're building a strategy, a resourcing strategy, which is principally what I'm concerned about. The first thing we need to know is what are we resourcing for and for when. And so with multi-domain battle, with an understanding of the future operating environment, we kind of have that question mostly answered, and we're heading in a direction. And as my boss said yesterday, it's not that we have to have it exactly right, but we have to be more right than our adversaries. So we've also heard the last 9 years, we've really focused on incremental improvements, getting capability to the force in the fight, counterterrorism and COIN principally. And so our resources have taken us, have supported those efforts. Also heard Secretary McCarthy say this morning that our platforms were essentially built in the 80s, and we've incrementally improved them over time. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves now is when does physics run out? When are we unable to continue to improve those technologies, those capabilities, and when must we start something new? And so, as I said, priorities are important. And if you haven't heard, I'm just going to reiterate what the Chief and the Secretary have said are our 6 priorities: long-range precision fires, next-generation combat vehicles, future vertical lift, the network, command, control, communications, and intelligence, air missile defense, and soldier lethality, and that's across shoot, move, communicate, protect, and sustain. So priorities are important. Aligning the organizational process and authorities is important. And then thinking in time is important for anyone who's doing a resource strategy. And so what we started last year to institute a process to think in time was called the SPAR, the Strategic Portfolio Analysis Review. And I'm sure most of you in this room have probably heard of that. And so in the 19 inaugural SPAR, we really focused on the near term. What are those capabilities we must focus on to sort of dig ourselves out of a hole that the last 9 to 15 years of declining resources and a focus on CT and COIN has put us in. And so those near-term priorities, there were 10 of those that emanated from the SPAR, and it was air missile defense. So you're going to hear some continuity, and when you're thinking in time, what you're able to do in the near term certainly influences the midterm, and what we've got to do is string these together in a way that builds on existing current platforms, either with new or improved capabilities on those platforms or a new capability period. So air missile defense, long-range fires, munitions shortfall. We've invested a lot of resources in the near term to close that shortfall. The mobility, lethality, and protection of our BCTs, getting active protection systems on air and ground platforms, electronic warfare and SIGINT, cyber, and that's offensive and defensive, assured communications, and then vertical lift. So again, you hear some similarities in those, and that's a good thing because it's going to allow us to build on near-term investments as we reach the midterm. So also, FY19 SPAR being the first one that we did, we learned some lessons, and you may have heard these as well, but I think they're worth repeating. The first is that chronic underfunding of the research, development, and acquisition accounts has left us with significant gaps that we must close, and that's what we're getting after in FY19, and we'll continue to endeavor to close. There are no easy wins. You know, there was an expectation as we did the SPAR 19 that we could look at some low-hanging fruit, find some places to divest, and then reinvest in higher priority capabilities. At the end of the day, we had many more required capabilities and requirements than we had sources of lower priorities that we could reinvest to a tune of about 10% that was required. You know, and I'll repeat something I said at the Aviation Symposium a few weeks ago, and you may have heard this if you're a country fan. A singer named Chris Janson says, "I know everybody says money can't buy happiness, but it can buy me a boat, and it can buy me a truck to pull it." And so money can solve a lot of our problems, and that's one of the things that we've realized in SPAR 19. Being chronically underfunded, as I said, we've been $6 to $8 billion in the hole every year in our RDA accounts, and the Secretary and the Chief are certainly working to close that gap. An infusion of funding would help us to close those gaps and to be able to do things differently. And then finally, we have to find a way to make room for emerging technologies as they become available. And when I say find a way, find room, I'm talking about resources. I'm talking about clearing space in either the emerging requirements or existing capabilities to free up resources to reinvest against the higher priorities. So this year for SPAR 20, we're going to shift our focus from the near-term effort to looking at the midterm in principle. And so if you are successful in executing the near-term, the POM, through FY25, if those resources stay put, you'll have closed many of the gaps that are the near-term gaps, but you'll have addressed a few of the midterm gaps that are still existing. And so what we've got to do is focus on where are the decision points in the midterm that will allow us to do something different. And so what are the things that we need to know in order to make those decisions? So one, we said resources. You've got to align the resources and make free up space to actually have resources to invest in something new. Two, you have to understand where the technologies that are in S&T coming out of RDECOM, when are they going to be available? When will they reach a technological readiness level that a program manager or a PEO could take, like Scott Davis on my right, and be able to put into his programs to improve the capabilities of existing platforms or to start a new program. And then finally, we need to understand if we've got the organizational and the conceptual piece, the doctrine piece correct, so that we have a new way of using these capabilities. We don't need to roll new capabilities in if we don't have the concept designed and the organizational structure to put those capabilities in to actually provide a capability. The piece of kit itself is not the capability, it's the integration into those formations. And so the last thing, as I started with, on sort of thinking in time in our history, what I said was continuity of priorities over time is going to be critical in my perspective. And so what's the Army doing to ensure that we have continuity and priorities over time? One, you've heard the initiatives that the Army will continue to look at on how do we align our structures, our organizations, our processes, and our resources and authorities to do things differently. I think that's going to set the conditions for a long-term approach. And we'll learn more about that as General Cardone works in the next 120 days to flesh that out. But the other thing is, with the SPAR and the AROC, what we have done is we brought in commanders. And it's a very focused process now that it's command-centric and not staff-centric. And so when we bring in 3-star commanders and 4-star commanders in those forums, you're building on the future leadership of the Army, and you're able to span, I think, administrations. You're able to span changes in senior leadership, because the 3-stars that are voting on priorities and resource implementation in the SPAR or the AROC will be future 4-stars and be able to continue across those, or bring those priorities across those different transition points that we have in our Army senior leadership. I think it's extremely important for us, not only in the resourcing, but also in the programmatic and in the PEO, the PM life cycle approach to starting and finishing delivering a capability and not having the stops, the starts and stops that we see sometimes that are disruptive to actually delivering a piece of kit. So with that, I'm gonna stop. I look forward to your questions, and I'm gonna turn it over, I think, to Mr. Davis.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I want to thank AUSA for pulling this great panel together, and most of the folks, I think, at this table I've worked with for a very long time and have deep admiration for. So a little bit, I'm the old guy, right? So I've been around buying stuff for 30 years, and by the way, I have no spouse or children in the audience to grade me, so I'm good.
Yeah, Shannon's my spouse. She's up here. She won't grade me, but she can give us a woo-woo every once in a while. She'll cheer us on.
So when Alicia mentioned this conference and it's, material readiness for the future, one of the things you think about is, what does that mean, and can you visualize that? A lot of times, whenever you think of a strategy, it's moving ahead and then looking back and say, how did I get to where I'm at today, and was I successful? And I think when you think of that, it indicates that the systems we'll have will be modular, they'll be interoperable, and that will have been designed in, that they'll be suited for austere environments. And when I say that, require a low degree of support, or as low as possible, either with fuel or parts or those kinds of things, and be able to adapt to poor infrastructures, because we're now a force projection Army going to a lot of places that have nowhere near the infrastructure we enjoy. And some of the attributes that you find are, reliability, maintainability. So if the part does break, even though it's much more reliable, can we get at it, get it out, and get a new part and get the system back into the fight? I mentioned, of course, we talk a lot about lethality, but it's the mobility, because I think a lot of places where we could potentially have some terrain characteristics and infrastructure characteristics that will challenge our current systems. And since I deal predominantly in the combat support, combat service support, being able to move those supplies, that fuel, that water, that ammo forward is going to be critical. And then efficient. So when I talk about that future, then it's how do we get to that future? And it usually starts with the requirements perspective. And so I think some of the discussions we've been having about these cross-functional teams and bringing all of this intellect to bear to sort of wrangle with these requirements up front is going to be huge. And it's getting that warfighter input, it's getting the technologist input, the engineer's input, to really help us flesh out where we need to go with these requirements. I think the prototyping is great, and I think we're going to have to do some of that, but I would argue that we have some really, really advanced system engineering and trade space analysis tools. And I'll give you an example. So when we were doing the ground combat vehicle system before, we had 5 engines to choose from, 10 transmissions to choose from, 6 armor packages, manned and unmanned turrets, different sensors, different guns. And we put them all into this optimization tool and crunched it, and it came out with 6 times 10 to the 19th possible concepts for that vehicle. And now you can look at those aggregated physics underpinned concepts and say, I'm not interested in anything over 60 tons. I'm not interested in anything over $13 million. I'm not interested in anything that has less mobility than a Bradley. And you can very quickly shrink those down and drive yourself into a sweet spot or a knee in the curve of capability versus cost. And then I think you'd grab a hold of one of those or more than one of those and then investigate that prototyping, get it into the hands of soldiers, and let them evaluate to see if it does what they need it to do and closes those critical capability gaps. When I think about how you implement this in acquisition, and I mentioned requirements, I think of acquisition in big chunks, right? It all starts with an idea that starts to go into a requirements process, and then that through some analytics, we finalize the requirement, and then we build an RFP and specifications. We compete, we do the design, and then we do some testing, and we get it into the field. Without understanding what each of those pieces are and how long they are today, it's hard to figure out where we need to put our biggest efforts to attack those. So as an example, and I think the CFT is going to go after it, requirements, as I've observed over 30 years, are 18 months to 2 years to get a requirement through, some longer, some shorter, but that's not a bad average. The resourcing piece also has to come along with that, and the requirement has to get to 1-star staffing in the building before it can compete for resources, which will actually be received 2 years hence. So I think there's something that has to be done there to say, if we really want to turn this faster, is there some way we can have maybe more fungible funding that can be allocated if we have a breakthrough or something we want to move more quickly? And then contracting, right? If I'm using FAR-based contracts, and it's competitive, it's over 2 years from a package available to a contract award through a competition. That's with a FAR-based contract. We've been granted some new authorities under this other transactions agreements. We've been able to turn contracts in months, 2 months, 3 months. And so I think we're going to be needing to leverage that more, because I think that gets the industry engaged and it gets it going. The next big thing, as we talk about getting industry engaged, as we describe our requirements, we have to ensure that we ask the what and the why, and that's well thought out. The how oftentimes becomes a constraint to the acquisition process. And I know sometimes it's easy to go to the how, because I saw it at AUSA, I saw it on the floor. But I'm telling you that if you get the what and the why in terms of what the capability is that the warfighter needs, it gives us more maneuver space. It opens that industry perspective a lot broader. And then as you carry that system into the future, it has the ability to be upgraded without having to go back and change the requirement. Because I've had lots of examples, but if you tell me it has to be protected against a current threat, rather than tell me it has to have reactive armor tiles, or it has to have active protection, or it has to have any number of things that are the hows, I can continue to upgrade those features as technology matures and still get after the same operational gap. Some big things as we think about laying out these requirements through these CFTs, it's very important to look at that system and those unique gaps, but it's also equally critical to look at the whole formation implications. So as an example, if I decide to put more armor APS on an Abrams tank, which increases its weight, have we really thought through what does it do to my trucks? What does it do to my rail transport? What does it do to the air transport? What does it do to its own off-road mobility in soft soil conditions, right? And I think we're going to be challenged there, but we've got to think about that stuff up front as we do these requirements. We talked a little bit about the OTAs and some of the mechanics of it. One of the things that I look for if somebody says, hey, if you look across your PMs or your APMs, what do you see in a really strong one? And it's somebody that understands the rules, but thinks critically, right? And oftentimes I tell them, acquisition can be very complex. It's got a lot of statutes. It's got a lot of regulations. It's got a lot of things embedded in it. But I said, every case, you can probably translate that to how you would buy something yourself, whether it's a house, whether it's a car, and questioning the requirements that drive affordability, drive availability, and challenging your own team on things that they derive in the specifications, the way they go after contracts, and the way they drive industry behavior. So we've got a number of examples where we were given a little more leeway in the requirements, but the user was very clear to us there were certain elements of those requirements that were more important than others. And through incentives in the source selection, we drove contractor behaviors to deliver 4 and 5 times the threshold requirement within the same cost cap, simply by using competition and the right incentives to influence behaviors. So I think there's a lot of best practices that we can take forward. And so I'm anxious to get after some of these things as a team more, and rather than just requirements and resourcing and acquisition sort of in our own stovepipes. I think with that, as we look at it, and I talked about the interoperability, the other piece that we have to understand is as you think about and you start to formulate the system design, that open architecture and that modularity that has to be there, and having your folks, both industry and government, truly understand the architectures, because that leads you to cyber things. So if you know everything that's interconnected to a critical function, and you can think about how you protect it before you firm up the design, you're way ahead in cyber. If you think about the future, as General George mentioned, and the thought that I may want to, at some point, make that platform fully autonomous or semi-autonomous, what sort of architectural hooks do I have to put in there as I make that design to enable us to add that at some future point? Maybe we can't afford it now, but how do you build it in? And then, I think in sort of summary from me is the big A acquisition that I talked about that has all those different chunks and all those different stakeholders is a team sport. And the more focused we are as a team, and the more we get together and understand and work those trades and have those discussions, hard discussions up front, the better off we'll be. And I'll leave it at that. And I think, Alicia, are we over to Mr. Thompson?
Yes?
Yes, that's fine. And then General
Okay.
Davidson.
Thanks, Scott. Good morning. Since I'm the only outsider on today's panel, I'm going to say some things that insiders probably wouldn't say and might not agree with. I have 3 points to make about what I call the political realities of material readiness. The first point is that the Army is never going to get the money it needs to modernize if it doesn't present its material requirements to the political system in a more compelling fashion. We've heard a lot in recent years about how tight budgets are starving military modernization accounts, but somehow the Air Force is managing to buy a new fighter, a new bomber, a new tanker, and a new trainer all at the same time, not to mention a replacement for the Minuteman ICBM. The problem with Army modernization isn't lack of money, it's the low priority our political system assigns to the material readiness of soldiers. The U.S. economy is going to grow to $20 trillion next year. And what that means is that every day our economy will be producing $55 billion in output. Every day, at twice the economy of North Korea. Thus, even with Trump administration increases, the Army's entire budget for 2018, OCO included, represents only 3 days of economic activity. And all the money requested for Army modernization amounts to a mere 3 days of government spending. In other words, less than 1% of the federal budget. We Americans spend a lot more money on lottery tickets than we do on equipping our soldiers. $70 billion a year for lottery tickets, $80 billion a year for cigarettes, $100 billion a year for beer. So it's pretty obvious that the material readiness of soldiers is not a high priority for our political culture. If the Army can't do a better job of telling its modernization story, things are likely to stay that way. Which brings me to my second point. Part of telling a persuasive story is to acknowledge the role of other military services and allies in future conflicts. Now, if you read through the Army's various vision statements, you will get the distinct impression that it's going to be out there all by itself in a future European war, unable to count on NATO's air dominance or on sea power. But that is simply not the case. By 2020, over 600 F-35 fighters will have been delivered to the U.S. military and allies, the vast majority of which will be available on short notice for operations in Europe. Now, whatever you may think you know about the F-35, the key fact is that it can't be tracked or targeted by Russian air defenses. I mean, really, no kidding. In exercises, it's winning by better than 20-1 against adversary aircraft because it is virtually invisible to enemies. However, it can see adversary aircraft and ground formations with unprecedented clarity. It has a built-in capacity to degrade and destroy items like surface-to-air missiles and missile launchers for long-range fires with both kinetic and non-kinetic means. So, NATO will enjoy overwhelming air superiority in future European wars, as will the joint forces on the Korean Peninsula. This will significantly mitigate concerns the Army has about air defense, long-range fires, control of the electromagnetic spectrum, and other warfighting challenges. Now, I'm not saying the F-35 is going to be the best close air support plane ever, and I'm not saying it'll be great at shooting down low-flying drones. But if multi-domain battle as a concept means anything, it means taking into account the contribution that other services can make to winning a war. And at the moment, I don't see much reflection of that in the Army's vision documents. That brings me to my third point, which is also about telling a convincing modernization story here in Washington. I think we can all agree that we need to rebuild electronic warfare skills and come up with solutions to dealing with the proliferation of drones. But when you get to the big muscle movements and material readiness plans, the story is pretty hard to follow. For instance, the Army apparently wants to kill Increment 2 of the Warfighter Information Network, WINTI, even though that would leave commanders in Europe without communications on the move for many years to come. Now, how many times have we heard the chief say that anybody who's standing still is dead during the early days of a future war? So what is Congress supposed to make of the proposal to kill the only comms on the move option we have at the moment? The Future Vertical Lift program to replace legacy rotorcraft with new airframes sharing common electronics makes a lot of sense. But instead of picking a winner for the Apache and Black Hawk replacement in 2019 and moving into development, the Army wants to waste 5 years repeating an already conducted risk reduction phase. We've already done all this in the Joint Multi-Role Program. Why do it all over again and waste a few $100 million in 5 years? The Long-Range Precision Fires replacement of ATACMS is a promising initiative for catching up with Russia in fires, but it's hard to see how we can ever achieve overmatch if cluster bomb restrictions limit the future munition to a unitary warhead. Yet I don't hear anybody in the Army asking the new administration to revisit the cluster bomb restriction, even though there are other ways of getting at the concerns that it was designed to address. I could go on. My bottom line is that it won't matter whether budget caps get repealed if the Army can't do a better job of competing with the other services and other federal missions in the marketplace of ideas. We are about to get a new national security strategy that is all about air power and sea power, which tells me senior policymakers don't grasp the value of land power. If the Army is ever to overcome its shortfalls in material readiness, that political problem needs to be fixed. Thank you.
So I guess I'm last on the panel. First, it's an honor to be here on the panel. If you listen to all I just said and put it in perspective of what I'm going to tell you about my AOR, where I operate in the Pacific, you'll understand the complexities of what we're facing for the future. The future development of systems and of delivery methods is critical to success. And I'll talk about the Pacific and the region I work in every day, but every region has their own challenges, and you have to understand that we can't create equipment for a specific region to a massive degree. We need to have an army of equipment that can go global. And so we have to make sure we understand all the complexities of all of the regions and figure out how we get to the most efficient capabilities. So I am the commander of the 8th Theater Sustainment Command. As such, I work in the Pacific. The Pacific region is culturally, socially, economically, and geopolitically diverse. 36 nations comprise the Asia-Pacific region and home to more than 50% of the world's population, 3,000 different languages, several of the world's largest militaries, 5 nations allied with the United States through mutual defense treaties, 2 of the 3 largest economies and located in the Pacific, as well as 10 to 14 of the smallest. More than a third of the nations are smaller island nations, including the smallest republic in the world and the smallest nation in Asia. The region is a vital driver of the global economy and includes the world's busiest international sea lanes and 9 of the 10 largest ports. The Asia-Pacific is also a heavily militarized region with 7 of the world's 10 largest standing militaries and 5 of the world's declared nuclear nations. Given these conditions, the strategic complexity facing the region is quite unique. And the AOR consists of more than 50% of the Earth's surface, an area of over 100 million square miles, mostly water. These challenges, of course, present unique opportunities for us. As logisticians, we're forced to think more expeditionary, lightweight, and mobile. We get after that through a series of exercises called Pacific Pathways, where we join it's a 3-part series of exercises to increase the readiness through additional training and strengthened partner-force relationships. USAPAC is able to synchronize theater logistics, leverage the joint logistics enterprise partners, execute mutual logistics support agreements, acquisition cross-service agreements with partner countries. We develop relationships early with our partners and understand any capability gaps prior to the operation or any humanitarian efforts. This has identified the need for professional development. As you may have read yesterday in the daily report, General Brown has stood up a regional leader development course to ensure we understand the challenges we're going to face in the region prior to having to face those challenges. This was evident that we was successful when on a specific Pacific Pathways, we had a challenge with a ship that went aground. That ship was designed to help feed the troops in the exercise, so we had to, on the spot, figure out how to feed troops. We collaborated with DLA to get Class 1 support that was already on the ground. We borrowed a Royal Thai kitchen trailer, and we used their kitchen to cook our food for our soldiers. Part of the challenge of this is we have to understand experimentation. We have to understand what's going to be coming up in the future, and how do we leverage that in our theater. We also have to understand the joint, as was identified earlier. We will fight a joint fight anywhere we go in the world, and the logistics particularly, it will be a joint solution set. The logistics requirements across the globe are the same. We all have to eat, we all have to be clothed, we all have to have weapons. And the delivery of that is distribution regardless of which service is supporting. Experimentation and employing equipment will require go to smaller task forces with multi-domain battle. The need to be expeditionary is tremendous. Expeditionary comms are critical. Log reporting and common operating picture is going to be vital to the success of the future. We have to have quite a bit of a sizable logistics package. The challenge is you have a small force going in. Every lift counts, and that lift wants to be firepower. We have to find out how to get the logistics support for those lifts embedded into that firepower so that we can continue to offer diverse complexities to the enemy. We do also believe in the future of drones. We think drones will be, and autonomous vehicles will be a way to deliver logistics to these small areas, particularly in the Pacific where I have island nations. The ability to get there easily, it does not exist. Some of the nation's ports will not support any of our larger shipping requirements, and so we have to come into different solution sets, and drones or autopiloted potentials are out there. I'm not going to go any further because I really want to get after the questions we're going to have. I think the bottom line today is we have to develop our leaders to understand the need to make critical decisions and understand the full breadth of what's going to be at their fingertips in the future. And the folks at this table that have talked all about the way they're going to go about developing the future, it really is about a collaboration, about understanding where we sit out on the battle space and understand how they can help us get to where we need to be tomorrow on that battle space. So I appreciate all the efforts of all of you today as you spoke out here, and I think we can go to questions.
Okay, all right. So I've been asked to moderate the questions, and I think the way we're going to do it, because I haven't seen any questions come forward, is anyone who has a question can certainly go to the mic and ask the question. But in light of that, and we'll give you an opportunity to kind of get your thoughts together and think about those questions, I do have a set of opening questions here that I can ask the panel members. So I thought about how I was going to do this, and I said, well, Ms. Adams, she works for my boss, so she's not going to get the first question. So although Dr. Thompson is my new favorite target here because of his opening comments, I think about Bo Dyess, who I had to always follow into jobs, and since Bo, you always left me with problems, then I could ask you the question. Or John, I could ask you the question because I never left you with problems as you followed me into jobs. So I think what I'll do is I'll start with Bo. Major General Dyess, you mentioned engaging industry early and often. How do you think we should go about doing that? Second part of the question is, what should we share? What can we share? And how do we prioritize who we should engage with? And the last part of the question is, what can we learn from members of industry?
Well, Cedric, must not have left you with many problems because you've been very successful in your career up to this point. About 2 years ago, we had an engagement that was co-sponsored by the Commander of Training and Doctrine Command, Commander of Army Materiel Command, at the College of William & Mary in Williamsburg, and it was essentially a summit to talk about innovation and how we could partner with industry. My task was to conduct a panel and or a working group in which I would report out to the 2 4-stars in the assembled group of people. And the question was, what are the barriers to innovation that industry has with government, in particular the Army? And so I went back to do the report out, and I reported to the 2 4-stars that based on what our combined lawyer team had interpreted the Federal Acquisition Regulation, that no industry personnel could be a part of the working group in order to determine the barriers to innovation between industry and government. So since that time, we've done 2 things. We had identified 3 problems. First problem was industry did not know what the Army wanted. Second problem, there was no forum in which to address that. And the third problem is that small businesses very rarely had a chance in order to break into the open. Even small areas here on the floor at AUSA are relatively expensive depending on how small of an industry or a business you are. So since then, we've done 2 things, one that we've just finished and one that we're conducting in conjunction with AUSA now. The first one was a capabilities information exchange in which we put a FedBizOps announcement out and told industry to come to TRADOC, and that we would share with them what we saw as our gaps, which we have not been able to share with them prior to that. We would do a contract with the businesses, and then they would provide us a report back at the conclusion of that engagement. And so over the period of an entire day, we had people from both the Army Capabilities Integration Center as well as people from the Centers of Excellence and other representatives from program managers as well as the testing community to come together to answer industry's questions about what the Army's biggest gaps were. Up until this time, it had been a big mystery to them. So I think that at least the anecdotal feedback was that this was a very important session, that the industry gained a lot from that, that really they want to know where to invest their IRAD money, their investment accounts for research and development, so that they have got the ability to look at. We asked them what time of the year. Some of them said the time of year of October or August time frame is good for them. Others said our financial cycle would really say a February time. So we're going to do another one. Capabilities Information Exchange will have a FedBiz Ops announcement, and we will allow industry to come and ask us questions about our gaps that we see across the force inside of the Army. The third problem that I mentioned was small businesses really didn't have a chance to break into the open, and so another FedBiz Ops announcements, the Forum for Innovative and Novel Discovery, the FIND, F-I-N-D. We're actually conducting that now in conjunction with AUSA, in which we put out a FedBiz Ops announcement that says we want to look at small businesses, and we define it, and we want you to bring your potential solutions to a panel of general officers. And I would describe this more like a Shark Tank with no money. But what it does do is provides insight from the panel of general officers, which includes folks from RD Ecom, from the acquisition community, from the resourcing community, from the requirements community. And so really, I think if you ask them anecdotally, it will be the points of contact that they've gained from discussing their potential solutions that they have. And I sat in on the three of those industries yesterday, a radar solution with a small business, a very interesting battery discussion that's not electrochemical, which has got potential, and some vertical lifts. So I mean, it's very interesting, and so I think those three problems we're trying to get after, Cedric, through the Capabilities Information Exchange and the Forum for Innovative and Novel Discovery.
Could I suggest one other way of getting buy-in from industry? That's for the Army to buy something, right? These people are in the business to make money. They have a lot of capabilities, but they also have a lot of other places that they could invest their capital. So when a customer only buys one tank a month, or when it says it desperately needs an armed reconnaissance helicopter and then cancels the program 3 times in a row, or spends 7 years developing a mission command system and then out of the blue, for reasons nobody can explain, says, we've changed our mind, we want to kill it. This doesn't exactly make industry inclined to trust that customer when the next opportunity comes along.
I'd defer that question to John George.
The two guys on my left didn't leave me any problems. I didn't hear that as a question. So I'm not going to debate the merits of an Air Force program or the Chief and the Secretary's decision on the future network, but I will say that there's been a great deal of analysis has gone into the network decisions, and there are certainly vulnerabilities that exist that we must fix in our current network. And I think the process and the way ahead for the network is you're going to see it streamlined, and we're going to do what the Secretary said this morning: try, buy, decide, try, buy, and then decide before we put it in the hands of soldiers for a long-term solution. So do we have enough money to buy more than a tank a month? Do we, so if you were to ask me what's missing in our ability to, other than money, in our ability to deliver capabilities, it is one of the things that Lauren said on having a narrative that is compelling, understood, and I think what you're seeing with our senior leaders now with 6 new priorities, there's clarity, there's continuity, and I think there's coherence in what we're doing to get after future capabilities. So if you ask me what else is missing, I would say it's the invisible F-35, because it's, you know, we out of all of the services certainly would like to have the support, the air superiority that we've had over many years, and it's a combat multiplier. It's the joint force at its best when we have those capabilities working together. But again, our analysis, the lessons that we've learned from the Russian New Generation Warfare study, what we have seen our potential adversaries do in the realm of air warfare bears and brings to question the ability for us to work inside of the A2AD bubble and live under air supremacy that we've had in the last 40 years, I would say. So the joint force, the multi-domain battle, and Bo can talk more about this, working hand in hand with our sister services to describe this new way of warfare in the future with emerging and quickly emerging capabilities that changes the future operating environment. We must do things differently, but we must work together, as Lauren has said. And I think, again, there's no greater champion to the joint fight than the Army and the Army's leadership.
So I guess just to add to that, and we'll go to your question, sir, on the left. I think that all of us agree that you know, the model that we're using for how we go from a concept to a capability was kind of fashioned as the Secretary laid out the timeline this morning about when these different processes or these different organizations were established. And it still kind of represents an industrial age model, if you will, on how we go from getting a concept to a capability. And so I think we all recognize that change needs to occur, and even if we don't recognize it, the senior leadership of the Army has recognized it, and so we'll have to make the adjustments. I've said before, and I'll say it again, that as we begin to think about where those adjustments need to occur, it really needs to be from the left end of that, the concept piece, all the way to the capability piece. And so when Bo was talking, he talked about the amount of time that it takes to go from the production of a requirements document. And then when you layer into that equation, you think about the amount of time that it takes just to get the funding in position. Add to that the strategy that you're going to have to come up with if this is a developmental item and how long that takes, and all the different types of risk management parts of that process that you have to build into getting that capability. And oftentimes you think about how then when we get to the production end of it, how we're challenged with our resources because of the number of items that we have. So I think as we begin to think about this, we've got to look at all those different areas, because we're, depending on what example you want to use in terms of failed or canceled programs, there are going to be a number of factors that weighed in that led to that cancellation, and they won't all be the same for whatever failed program you want to point to as the example. There have been times when we've overreached on our requirements. There's been times where we probably tried to introduce too much technology on existing platforms where you had to system engineer new technology with an old platform. There have been times when we've done things from a resource perspective where we created these long tails, if you will, or these long buying production, which were inefficient. And so I think as we think about it, we're going to have to make those adjustments across the line.
Sequestration.
Absolutely, sequestration as well. So, sir, you have a question?
Yes, sir. First of all, thank you very much, everybody in the panel, for taking so much time out of today's schedule in order to talk to us here today. My name is Jens Parks. I retired from the Air Force about 15 years ago, and it is interesting that most of the battles that we're fighting in acquisition still remain the same. Dr. Thompson's statement in particular was ringing so true to me. I'd like to frame my questions in terms of systems engineering, 3 bubbles: technology bubble, the policy bubble, and the cultural bubble. Dr. Thompson really spoke eloquently about the cultural bubble and the problems that we're still encountering this one. Most of our acquisition system focuses on the technology bubble. Very well, and that's basically what we're buying is technology. Yet for many decades, and even today still, we're still having problems with the policy bubble. I'm thinking anything from standards, Internet of Things, how do you relate things to each other? How do we now have our multi-operation strategy with the other sister services? I remember working very well in Iraq with the Army, but a lot of times that was, quite frankly, we made our own doctrine because Air Force and Army doctrine did not talk to each other. How do we motivate our acquisition professionals, instead of asking for waivers, because that's the easy way to ask for it and because the general is going to get another star out of it, to say, no, we're going to have to adhere to those standards first, and if they don't exist, let us go to the national bodies to make those work. Because the Internet of Things, which I'm working with right now, technology will not be a solution. We are talking about volumes of data that no technology can possibly ever let us reach. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
I'll just ask, do you want to come back in the Army?
Air Force.
I know you were in the Air Force, but come to the real Army.
Yes, I'm working with the Army, I'm working with the Navy, and I'm working with Special Forces right now. That's why it really rings true to me.
And I'll just start, if that's okay, Cedric. I'll say I agree 100%. I think one of our challenges is the full communication of the policies that do exist. I think as we go out and make things work, we've had to jury-rig a lot of solutions. We don't document that. We don't go back and see how we may have countered some policy by a tweak, not violated it, maybe just change it a little bit. And over time, that incremental change becomes totally different perspective. And so I agree. I think it gets back to what we talked about earlier about the importance to have a conversation with industry, with folks that have solution sets out there that we may not know to ask. We can't get your solution, we're going to ask you for it. So you really got to open up the conversations of all the technological challenges and potential solutions we find so that more can contribute to that. And then we've got to go back to the schoolhouse and our doctrine and write it down and make sure we understand what works and what doesn't work, and then get buy-in from our sister services, because it is the regional fight, and we have to all speak the same way.
Okay, so I think since you mentioned a couple of times in your question technology and science and technology, I'll try to tackle at least a portion of this. So I agree that we are challenged through our policies in some instances, and as I alluded to earlier, that's a part of, you know, going from this whole idea of a concept to a capability, and I only really talked about it, but it is, in most instances, the way we do things, it's in a linear construct. And we are, as we meander through that process, or as we work our ways through that process, we have to adhere and recognize kind of the policies, the rules by which we operate along that path. But for me, I think one of the things that we have to be accepting of is, number one, we need to oftentimes stay focused on the capability that we're trying to get to. Oftentimes, we have a conversation about technology for technology's sake when we ought to be talking about the capability that we're going to get to. And so that examination and that understanding of a capability, given the certain framework of the ilities that we want, increased lethality, increased mobility, the ability to do things, it has to start at that beginning end in the concept piece. But we have to make sure that we don't lose sight of that as we work our way through the concept piece, going into the resourcing piece, the acquisition piece, and then the delivery piece. And then I think we have to understand how those technologies, if you will, contribute to meeting the tenets of those ilities. And in some instances, we aren't quite good at delivering the technologies that are needed because the industry is better. And in those instances, we have to be accepting of that and bring more of the industry partnership into our early efforts in what we're doing to evaluate those concepts, reinforce that those concepts can bring about improved capability for the warfighter, and then an understanding of how those technologies can get us to where we need to go. And in those instances where the technology exists within industry, we ought to be able to challenge the system about the enormous amount of testing we have to do, the length of time that it takes to get these things incorporated into the system, especially if we're talking about a developmental effort. But I think that we have to challenge the policies across the board, the policies and the rules that exist by which we test things, the policies and rules by which we develop technology, and the challenges that we have in terms of how we resource things.
It's on the standards piece. I think you bring up a really good point. And so part of the conversation we've had recently on the Army staff is, we talk about programs of record. So there's this idea of how do you create sort of a standards of record or a program of standards, whichever kind of way you want to make it, especially with the network when we talk about interfaces, requirements for sort of the plug and play concept, being able, if you can define the highway, and everybody's car that gets on the highway has to adhere to that, and there are rules to getting on and off, and as a very basic analogy, I think that's a critical thing that we've got to do as we move forward. Sometimes we shouldn't be defining the standards. We should be adopting commercial standards because they're, in many ways, the commercial industries, in particular with IT, probably network, any computing type capabilities are far ahead of where we will be, and we ought to leverage the massive amounts of investments with things like what banking does with cyber, et cetera. And so I know Scott Davis in our robotics program is working along those same lines. So I just thought Scott might want to mention something.
Yes, sure, and I can talk some about the robotics, but I think to pull a thread on where you really were was sort of at that higher level. So I rarely use the F word, but I used to be the chief engineer for FCS, right? And I believe it was an overreach in terms of how much we could afford and bring in terms of technology. But, it's unfortunate. I think it's true. Lauren could probably tell me across Department of Defense, when you have a program that isn't successful, it becomes a pariah and nobody ever wants to talk about it again. But I think the front end piece of that, where we really understood the formation level requirements and all the derived requirements and interfaces inside and outside to the joint forces and things, because when we talk about lethality and somebody says I need greater lethality, too often we focus on an individual system and say the tank needs a bigger gun or we need a longer caliber artillery piece, and we don't really thoroughly flesh out inside that formation where, as long as I'm interconnected and I understand those interconnections, can I leverage the lethality somewhere else in the formation in my zone or in my sector real time, because I've identified who needs to transmit what and call for different things. So I think that's super important. I think we got away from it since FCS, because the requirement was written at the formation level, and then you derived all of the platform requirements and interfaces inside. In fact, I think individual information exchange requirements between nodes, which could include a person or could include a platform, there were over 385,000 unique information exchange requirements, which then helped you define the network. It helped you define what pieces you could leverage, all that sort of stuff. And so on a sort of micro scale with the robots, we're leveraging something called IOP, or interoperability profile, and it's been sort of adopted across services. But the idea is, as you look at a robot, the things that don't change very much are its chassis and its tracks and its propulsion system. But the things that change very, very frequently, sensors, manipulators, and all sorts of other things. And so building into that chassis this IOP profile and then promulgating that to industry, who makes all those other pieces in a very clear and acceptable standard, can now offer us these capabilities and upgrades pretty readily.
Speaking of FCS, I remember when that program began to slide, the Army mounted an effort to try to explain to outsiders what its goals were. And at one point, General Cody, then the vice, invited in a bunch of talking heads, myself included, to hear what had become the refined pitch for the future combat system, this family of armored vehicles. And he was really waxing poetic about the importance of the network and the transformative war-fighting potential of this architecture. And then, in an unfortunate turn of phrase, he said, now, you know, the problem with this approach is that if you're hit, you die. And there's just total silence in the room. And all these talking heads, a bunch of liberal arts majors who'd never served, you knew what they were thinking. This is crazy, all right? So this is what I'm talking about in terms of having a focused message. For all I know, FCS as in technology and as an architecture would in the end have worked. But once we get done talking about LRPF and APS and IAMD and whatever other set of initiatives you want to use, you've got to be able to go into the political system and explain it in common sense terms to people. Remember, 4 out of 5 members of Congress now have never served. You can't assume they know what a fire is.
So when
I'll take just on the culture part. So you talked about culture, you talked about technology, you talked about policy. Sometimes culture is good. A warrior culture, as we talk about it inside of the Army, is a good thing. If there's a part of culture that we deem as undesirable, like takes too long to get a capability to a soldier, I just think that leadership will trump culture, but it's got to be leadership at the appropriate level so that we are all pulling together. Priorities is important. Common message theme, as Lauren said, is very important. And then as I think it was the acting the secretary this morning said, then we have to conduct the river crossing operation of the Potomac to get to the other side, to Capitol Hill.
So to add to all the comments, and I thought your question was very good. And what I have seen over the years is, so for example, OSD issued a future logistics enterprise strategy. In that strategy, directed the services to address condition-based maintenance, public-private partnerships, performance-based logistics, laid out the strategy. It didn't come with funding, it just came with the mandate to do it. So the Army updated regulations, included that you will do these things. But what we didn't understand was what it took to implement that. And so when we started into onboard sensors for condition-based maintenance to be able to be more proactive in our supply and logistics aspects, we realized we had to have standards. You had to be able to have the data that was transmitted back to a warehouse that would come in a format that every platform, every system would provide in that same format, so we could readily, from the data, identify where we needed to take action. We had to have the architecture that would allow that data to be distributed. So when we went to the department and said, okay, this is what we need to implement that, we have the sensors on our platforms, we need the architecture, we need the data standards, we need the infrastructure to do it, then people were very upset because there was a bill that came with that. And, you know, you got the Army pregnant and now you're expecting us to pay for it. So I think part of getting after what you're talking about is making sure when we come up with strategies and ideas to be able to hold people accountable to implementing the standards and holding to that policy is articulating, you know, what goes along with that. But thank you for sharing that with us.
Thanks.
All right.
Were there-
Is there a question over here in the center or the left? I don't see.
To the right, there's somebody.
There's one here to my right, so on the left side again, sir.
General panel, thank you very much. John Beatty, I represent the state of Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, we have what's known as a Massachusetts Military Task Force, generally designed to support and strengthen all the military installations within the Commonwealth. And just 2 points, really two-part question, more for the research development technology end of it. There's a lot of talk about partnership with academia, partnership with industry, but is there a discussion and awareness and appreciation of partnerships with states, where particularly in Massachusetts, we have worked hard to connect for our own interests, to connect industry with state government, industry, and academia with the FFRDCs that are in the area. And we seek further public partnerships to enable the federal government's mission, whether it's Homeland Security or FEMA or whatnot. So in that respect, is there an awareness of that, an appreciation for states that are willing to step forward and help the U.S. Army accomplish its mission of building more capability and capacity? Second part of that is DIUX. I know we're talking about breaking paradigms here in the research development sector as well as the acquisition sector. DIUX is out there, it's operating, it's generally been very successful. Is there any move on the Army's behalf to plug into DIUX and make it sort of a joint acquisition cell? We had some different discussions about that. What's your vision for DIUX in the future?
So I guess let me start off because number one, you asked a great question. I can appreciate that you're from the Northeast, and so that's great. Number one, we do have and we do work towards those partnerships with the state, and I know because I've got one of my directors here sitting in the front, who is the director of our Natick Soldier System up in Natick, Massachusetts. And I know that the work that they do through the different cooperative arrangements are designed to get into the very, very large concentration of engineering and scientific expertise that resides and exists within your colleges and universities up there. And so we have, where we've worked partnerships with the Institute of Creative Technology with Lincoln Labs, MIT Lincoln Labs. NSRDEC works partnerships with other department agencies to establish different types of vehicles that would allow for cooperative study, cooperative plans, data sharing arrangements to facilitate not only the expertise that you have that has the potential to come into the workforce, because we are always looking for highly skilled people to come into the workforce as our workforce ages and people begin to transition out and retire, but also to be able to leverage that talent to bring about some of the various different technologies. So there are efforts that they're doing on soldier performance, human dimension, human aspects that are being worked on. There are partnerships that we've begun to work with folks like Under Armour and NFL and GE on different types of technologies that will help with traumatic brain injury and ways to help prevent that. And so I think there are some opportunities. That's not to suggest that we can't get better, and that's not to suggest that we have to do a better job of communicating how you get into those, how those doors are opened, where you can come in and you can lay out what your specific capabilities are, what your specific interests is. We are doing things up in Natick to try to build a center, if you will, that will allow, it's a facility that will allow for soldier performance to be looked at in one house mechanism where we can bring in industry partners, we can bring in academic partners. We're doing things within our research lab, going to your other point about the DIUX, understanding that DIUX was established by DOD, but we do have partnerships where we're working, where we're creating sharing arrangements for industry to come in and share with our technology. So we have folks out, innovation labs out on the West Coast as well. And I think what we're trying to ensure that we are understanding what the DIUX is looking at. The challenge I think we'll have, not only through a perspective of the DIUX, but also within the Army and RDECOM specifically, is the what. What are we trying to get out of those partnerships? Have we clearly defined an end state in terms of a technology that we're looking at? Is it some type of novel material that we're looking to get at? But we've established those types of partnerships not only out west on the West Coast, but down in Texas, up in Massachusetts, with the various different academic institutions. So I think what we need to do is we need to figure out a better way of communicating how those doors are open and can be opened, and they don't represent barriers of entry.
So I think you're probably aware, certainly I have what I consider a jewel at Fort Devens, right, with the Base Camp Integration Lab, and that's through a partnership with the Massachusetts National Guard. And it's wonderful because it allows us a test bed opportunity for, you know, contingency basing evaluations and those sorts of things, and that's been a wonderful partnership. And then coming from Michigan, I mean, we also have a close relationship with the National Guard there, whether it's in autonomous systems, you know, and so we do some of that up in Camp Grayling. We actually have now a big section of I-69 in Michigan that's cleared for experimentation of autonomous trucks, those types of things. And so when you ask, you know, how you might do it, so I'll tell you, we use or partner with the PTAC, and I'm sure you must have one of those in Massachusetts, which is really an outreach from the state to companies to help figure out how they can enter into the government business. And then I would suggest, if you have the wherewithal, we have a Southeast Michigan Advisory Council, which is a lot of folks from various counties and chambers of commerce that come to TACOM, where I'm co-located, and sort of try to understand what we as a community are looking for, and then use their connections back into industry and into state and local governments to help kind of pull that all together. And it's amazing, those kind of things. We meet, I would say, probably 3 times a year with this advisory council, but just a number of people that were willing, and we invited them in, and it's been a great thing for us.
Sure.
On the capability side, we're not as tied in with states. We're tied in probably more with the FFRDCs, the federally funded research development centers. Anecdotally, there are areas that are developing capabilities that we're interested in, like the portion of the interstate where we can drive our robotics vehicles on, the corridor that's being developed inside of New York State in order to fly drones and to be able to do experimentation with the electromagnetic spectrum requirements for the use of unmanned aerial vehicles. So for me, it's more episodic and anecdotal, probably that's gleaned through an existing Army or Department of Defense, or in the case of New York Homeland Security, already existing FFRDCs. That's how we get involved with it. Certainly, you've got the capacity and capability that's located in the greater Boston metropolitan area there to develop something like what Scott was talking about, or what's happening around Rome, New York, along that western corridor.
Thank you.
This is just a quick one. I guess my name is Ken Naker. It goes across just about everybody's.
Could you use the mic, please, because they're videoing us.
Thank you. Through all of this, one of the things that we just completed, we as a company, working with DARPA, was looking at a 96-hour engagement. How do you get to the other side with a brigade-sized force, and what are the gaps in that? And we looked through all of the commands, but the interesting thing is that we couldn't find a study. We could find many studies, but we couldn't truly find a study that had looked at this gaps across. And we looked at it from just a transportational and development flow, which is, you know, from General Davidson's hit, it goes back to yours, sir. But the interesting piece to me is, how do we build how do we build into the modernization program speed to get to our adversary? If we've got to get there for shock and awe in a certain time to be able to control that engagement location, whether it's in a small location or a large location or whatever, how do we put requirements into what the size of a system is, and how do we put this as a parameter on it so that technology and industry adapts to that as it goes through? Because I will tell you, industry will give you more on the side of the tank, and will give you the things to be able to do it. But if you can't get it to the adversary in the time, and the interesting thing out of that study that took just about 18 months was that there were many gaps, and a lot of those gaps were based around the equipment we had to move and the assets we had to get there. We looked at autonomous, Mr. Davis, from your area, we looked at a lot of other things. But I would say from a modernization program, what is it, General Dyess, that we build into that to get speed to adversary?
So we did our Army operating concept October 2014. We published Win in a Complex World. And from that, the centers of excellence, the 6 centers of excellence that do functional concepts, did their concepts looking at the future. I always, when I put the 6 functional concepts up first, I always use the movement maneuver concept that was developed between Fort Benning and Fort Rucker. I always put them first, because what they said in their functional concept is we need to have a formation, currently defined as a brigade combat team, that can operate semi-independently and with 7 days of resupply. Now, as you know, Armor Brigade combat teams, they eat about 240,000 gallons of diesel a day, and they need constant resupply in order to keep that capability. And it's obviously, with that concept, we cannot accomplish that today. But when I line up those 6 functionals, I always use that as the driving factor, because it's really across the board. It's like, is propellant the way we're going to use to deliver lethal effect to the enemy forever? Internal combustion engine, is that the way we'll propel our vehicles? So, I mean, that's a little bit farther out there, but in order to keep convoys off the road, which are large concentration of targets if you're a long-range fires guy with a near-peer adversary, or to keep large command posts from operating like we have over the last 15 years, so that you're mobile and agile, you've got to operate in a different way than you're operating now. So to me, that's what I use. I use the functional concept about things that we can't do now, and then you start to develop capabilities to meet that. Or we say, hey, we can't get there right now. We need a material breakthrough, or we need to be able to produce our own fuel or energy closer to the source of need.
So I would offer that it's truly my belief this is part of what's driving the new modernization strategy for the Army, trying to get all the requirements together at initiation of the development of the modernized equipment, so that we do get after that. We don't have a piece of equipment that can't be delivered, or we have a piece of equipment that can't be used because we can't get the other part, we ran out of money. So I think that the modernization strategy that we're going after now, we're going to create a single organization that goes across the full spectrum, is certainly going to get after some of that. My belief is, to answer your question, it's about setting the theaters. Each theater will be set independently for the fight we believe we would have to fight. And so in my theater, I would move more to locations that I expect to have to execute from. So to get something from New York to Guam is a long way, but to get something from Okinawa to Guam is significantly shorter. So when I set the theater, it doesn't just mean logistically set, it means forces, footprints, and agreements to make sure that we understand what our coalition partners can contribute to the fight, and how much of that we can leverage so that we don't have to do what you just commented on, is deliver ourselves. It is about not being the only dog in the fight. It's going to be a big wolfhound pack.
So can I just add just a couple of thoughts? One is, so we have to take a formation view. So our IBCTs are the most strategically deployable. we can move them pretty rapidly just about anywhere, but do they have the staying power to stay in the fight, or will they culminate, prior to achieving what their objectives are? And so one of the things that we've done to increase mobility, operational mobility, is by adding the ground mobility vehicle, the mobile protected firepower, and the light recon vehicle. So we're adding capability to a formation that can get there fast, and to allow it to fight and protect itself and to move offensively, and not when you come upon an objective have to resort to the defense. So that's one of the things we have to do, is think about our formations and the way we fight instead of the piece of kit itself, because there's always the dimensions of size, weight, power, and when you start talking about protection for armored capabilities, you've just seriously reached an impediment to moving things quickly across the ocean. And just one other thought is, we've reevaluated, and we're looking at our pre-positioned stocks to ensure that, in a sense, that gives you speed all on its own, because you can fall in on equipment that's regionally available.
So just to add, from a technology perspective, a couple of things that we're looking at that might help with the dilemma that you presented. So in addition to what General Dyess mentioned in terms of the ability to manage the consumption of a BCT as a formation, technology, from a technology standpoint, we're looking at ways to harness the power of power generation, where you have the ability to use batteries, recharge batteries through several different means, which might reduce the amount of resupply that you have to do. The consumption of meals. Every soldier that fights, right, he has to fight with some type of food in his stomach to be able to perform. And so we're doing things with our meals to examine and look at the intake, the amount of carbohydrates, and it's more of a scientific design in terms of the different types of things that from your calories, how much protein you need, how many carbs you need, very, very scientific, and bringing together packages of different meals that can add to what a soldier might need for the consumption of energy and the regeneration of energy in their own personal bodies. From a lethality perspective, you might think about certain types of technology that we're very dependent on bullets and rockets and things of that nature. We're working with our other partners outside of RDECOM, but certainly within the Space and Missile Defense side, who are the lead for the Army on laser development, about how you could use the development of lasers to provide you a capability that could go after various different types of either as a counter UAS system to mitigate the need for certain types of bullets, or complement what you already have to give you different options of how to go after those things, because you've got various different payloads to go after. I think the other thing I'd mention is when we think about those payloads that we do have, when you think about your basic load that you have to carry into a fight, is to get those different types of munitions, from small bullets all the way up to the big rockets, where the lethality of them, either through accuracy or the payload that they carry, are sufficient to do the job when they're required, that they have the precision-guided components necessary to be able to get after it. And then one of the things that we talked about when we start talking about the mobile protected firepower piece is really all about how you write and define the requirements. And so we know that we have to build certain requirements that allow us to meet that deployability objective and have the agility to fit on the platforms that will deliver us, the air platforms that will deliver us into a theater to allow us to set the theater. And so as you manage those requirements, you have to make sure that those requirements don't exceed the capacity of the folks who will deliver us. So when we start talking about a mold protected firepower platform that does not exceed 23 to 25 tons, I mean, that's what we're talking about. But it requires the type of discipline to make sure that we can define and get after those things.
So I think we're about out of time, so no more questions. I would just like to thank you all again for participating with us today. Thank you to the panel members. And as I reflect on what each one said, and from what the Secretary of Defense said yesterday, in terms of as we execute our purpose of the Army, we need time and resources to do it. So what you heard today was we need to be prepared, we need to be developed, and we need to have the resources to do what needs to be done. That's stable and predictable funding. It is stable priorities. It is allowing the capability that we have within the Army to be able to collaborate with industry, with academia, with other public entities in order to provide the warfighters what they need. So thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.